Robert Gibbs, you worked for years in very close proximity in the West Wing. You know how small those spaces are. Kevin Hassett, top economic advisor who recently returned to the White House, expressed some of those concerns very honestly yesterday. Let's watch.
It is scary to go to work. You know, I was not part of the White House in March. I think that I'd be a lot safer if I was sitting at home than I would be going to the West Wing. But I think everybody knows that going to work, you've been in the West Wing. You know, it's a small, crowded place. It's a little bit risky, but you have to do it because you have to serve your country.
Robert, what about the fact, for instance, that the vice president is still not wearing masks when we saw him in public recently? The lack of leadership from the president and vice president for what has been the guidelines. And can they be safely working in the White House?
Well, I think if I was working in the White House right now, I would figure out who is absolutely essential and send a lot of other people home. As you and Jeff mentioned, it looks like a big space on television, or it looked like that on TV shows, but in fact, it's very cramped. There's lots of people packed in rooms for meetings. It's not at all conducive to dealing with a pandemic or a virus. And I think, as was talked about, this greatly complicates the optics of the message of a president and his administration rushing to have people open up before they're ready. In reality, it's not about when a government wants it to open up or even a business wants to open up. It's when people have the confidence to go back out and continue some of the activities that they used to have before we all sort of started to stay at home. And I think if you watched Andrew Cuomo, that was a tour de force in the mechanics of public communication, in having people understand the steps that are necessary, the steps that the state and regional governments are taking that'll ultimately give people confidence that there's a reason and a rationale for what we should be doing and when, and how we should open up in a way that's slow and controls the continued rate of infection of this virus.
Secretary Sebelius, we understand now that Iowa's governor has decided to go into a limited or a modified quarantine, self-quarantine, because of her visit to the White House last week. You were a governor and you were an HHS secretary. What should they be recommending? What is safe?
Well, I think, Andrea, again, I'd go back, as Robert did, to what we just heard from Governor Cuomo. People are willing to make huge sacrifices for their health and their family's health, even if it involves some economic pain, which clearly we're seeing across this country. What they need is information, and they need honest facts. So CDC guidance, which was put out earlier, talking about the trajectory of downward disease trend, it set a national framework. The White House has now held on to the newest CDC guidance, which my understanding is a place-by-place information set of how you reopen child care centers, restaurants, offices safely. We have an example of a place where individuals are tested every single day. Nowhere else in the country is that going on, where the individuals are able to travel on private planes, where they are probably cleaned more frequently than any place else under the sun, and yet the virus is inside the White House. Definitely we want to keep the president, the vice president, key leaders safe and secure, but it gives the people information about the fact that they're not safe. Where is safe? We need the new CDC guidance. We need governors and mayors to be able to make intelligent decisions based on information. We're in the least tested state in the country. We have big outbreaks in meat processing plants, big outbreaks in prisons. We still have nowhere near the right amount of protective equipment or the right amount of testing for our governor and our local mayors and city officials to know if they're doing the right thing. People are willing to make sacrifices, but they need information, and they don't want to be stupid about it. We have a little glimpse of what it's like to be in an office where people refuse to follow the general principles. Wear a mask when you're inside. Stay 6 feet away. We've watched daily the White House officials, our president and vice president, refuse to do that, refuse to wear masks, refuse to stand far enough apart, continue to travel without that. And what we're seeing now is a virus outbreak that at least gives people the notion of what happens when you don't wear a mask and when you are too close together. But it doesn't provide much help or information for business owners, health officials, local leaders who really want information so they can give their citizens that information, and then people can make choices about doing the right thing.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.